Today is Wednesday, March 4th, 1964. Jack Ruby enters a plea of not guilty and not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Henry Wade and his team lay out the whereabouts of Jack Ruby on the weekend of the assassination, and we get an exclusive interview with the man handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald. Day one is in the history books.
I'm Eric Bushman.
And I'm Brandon Birmingham. This is the state of Texas versus Jack Ruby, the original trial of the century.
Dozens of spectators began drifting into the Dallas County Criminal Courts building this morning. Most of those gathering in the hallways and on the inside steps of the building said they had hopes of getting into the courtroom to see and hear what many are already calling the trial of the century. Newsmen said today's crowds were by far the largest since the Ruby affair began on February 17th.
Dressed in a neat blue suit, Jack Ruby rose from his chair to enter his plea to the murder charge against him. Beside him stood his lawyer, Melvin Belli. "Mr. Wade, will you arraign the defendant?" asked Judge Joe Brown. Mr. Wade, folded indictment in hand, walked around from behind the counsel table and took 6 steps to his left, stopping directly in front of the defendant, Jack Ruby. Mr. Wade put on his black horn-rimmed glasses and unfolded the indictment. Now facing each other, the defendant and prosecutor stood less than a yard apart. The district attorney began to read. "In the name and by the authority of the state of Texas, the grand jurors, good and lawful men of the county of Dallas and the state of Texas, duly elected, tried, impaneled, sworn, and charged to inquire of all offenses committed within the body of the said county of Dallas, upon their oaths do present in and to the Criminal District Court Number 3 of Dallas County at the October term, A.D. 1963, of said court that one Jack Rubenstein, alias Jack Ruby." The district attorney looked up. "Is that your name?" The defendant started to say something when he was interrupted by his attorney, Melvin Belli. "He answers to the name Jack Ruby." Mr. Wade continued, "On or about the 24th day of November in the year of our Lord 1963, in the county and state aforesaid, did then and there unlawfully, voluntarily, and with malice aforethought, kill Lee Harvey Oswald by shooting him with a gun, contrary to the form of the statute in such cases, made and provided, and against the peace and dignity of the state. Signed by the foreman of the grand jury." The district attorney then read his own name as the signer of the indictment, Henry Wade, criminal district attorney of Dallas County, Texas. Ruby bowed slightly at the waist and in a low voice answered not guilty. Melvin Belli wanted the record to show that Ruby and his lawyers were entering a double-barreled plea, not guilty and not guilty by reason of temporary insanity.
Through 13 witnesses, District Attorney Henry Wade laid out his case against Jack Ruby, the man accused of murdering alleged presidential assassin Lee Harvey Oswald on November 24, 1963. 5 newsmen, 5 Dallas police officers, 2 civilians, and the doctor who performed the autopsy on Oswald. Using these witnesses, Wade and his assistant, Bill Alexander, outlined Ruby's whereabouts during the days leading up to and following the assassination of President Kennedy. Dallas Morning News employees Don Campbell, John Newman, and Georgia Mayer all testified about their personal interactions with Ruby in the moments leading up to and just after President Kennedy was killed. According to those witnesses, Ruby was at the Dallas Morning News offices buying an ad for his nightclub called the Carousel Club located on Commerce Street. While the sale of the ad was taking place, the presidential motorcade was winding its way through the streets of Dallas. The prosecution entered into evidence 2 pictures depicting the view from the newsroom to the depository building, and were it not for some trees obscuring the view, a person standing in the office would have been able to see the assassination scene on Elm Street. Campbell says Ruby was acting normal. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Minutes later, when news of the assassination hit the office, Ruby and other employees surrounded a television and watched the breaking news. Ruby, just like everyone else, was stunned and quite upset. Later that day, at around midnight, KLIF reporter William Duncan said that he received a call from Ruby offering him an interview with District Attorney Henry Wade. Ruby made the call from the Dallas Police headquarters where Oswald was being questioned. A few hours later, at around 6 or 7 p.m., DPD Officer Rutledge saw Ruby at the Homicide Division at DPD headquarters offering sandwiches to police officers and newsmen. He was also helping out-of-town reporters by acting as an interpreter of sorts, identifying for them city officials and policemen.
The day after the president was killed, November 23rd, KRLD reporter Wes Wise was taking pictures at the schoolbook depository where he saw Jack Ruby. Wise told Ruby about a set of saddles that were made and given to President Kennedy's children. According to Wise, Ruby became emotional, tears welling up in his eyes. KLIF reporter Duncan also testified today that he had an interaction with Ruby, this time at around 1:30 on the 23rd, a few hours later after Mr. Wise. Ruby brought sandwiches and soft drinks to the station, staying for about half an hour. Ruby told Duncan that he was caught up in a commotion of newsmen and found himself standing right in front of Oswald. Ruby seemed pleased that he was caught up in something important, according to Duncan. Later that day, at around 4 p.m., DPD Traffic Officer Harkness testified he saw Jack Ruby and as part of a crowd at headquarters when Oswald was set to be transferred.
Continuing to outline the whereabouts of Ruby, a Western Union worker named Doyle Lane testified about one of the most important and controversial pieces of evidence in the trial: a money order sent by Jack Ruby for $25 to Karen Lynn Bennett, a dancer at Ruby's carousel club known as Little Lynn. An automatic timing device stamped at the time of the transaction as 11:17 a.m. on November 24th. According to testimony, it was 4 minutes later when Ruby killed Oswald in the City Hall basement. Lane testified that Ruby appeared calm, cool, and outwardly collected when he wired the money.
The next witness testified that he sold Jack Ruby the murder weapon, a Colt Cobra with a 2-inch barrel, serial number 2744, way back on January the 19th of 1960. The gun was shown to jurors today and introduced into evidence as Exhibit Number 6. Ray Brantley, owner of a hardware and sporting goods store located at 730 Singleton, was asked by the defense whether he had also sold guns to District Attorney Bill Alexander. He did, although he couldn't recall for jurors exactly how many.
Homicide Detective Jim Lavelle was the state's star witness for the day. Detective Jim Lavelle testified he was handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald's right wrist when he began the walk from Captain Fritz's office to the elevator that led to the basement of City Hall, a journey lasting 3 or 4 minutes. When the elevator doors opened at the bottom, he described that the television lights were bright, shining directly into his eyes, and that the area was very crowded. He next notices out of the corner of his eye a man coming in from the crowd of reporters and photographers right up to him, Oswald, and fellow DPD officer L.C. Graves. He identified the man as Jack Ruby. He immediately noticed a pistol in Ruby's right hand, raising it up as if he was preparing to shoot. Lavelle says he reached out for Ruby's shoulder as Ruby took 2 quick steps forward and fired the gun. His prisoner, Lee Harvey Oswald, made a noise and said, "Oh," and slumped to the floor. Lavelle was being pulled to the ground by Oswald's weight when he noticed Ruby's right hand still contracting as though he was attempting to fire another shot. Now, I interviewed Detective Lavelle about his experience, and you can hear him describe the walk from the elevator into the garage.
As we got off the elevator and started and come in through the jail office, when we got around to the door going out into the hallway, I happened to think they had told me that the car would be crossways the walkway. All we had to do was just get into the back seat, and so I stopped just before I walked out in there. Captain Fritz was out in front, and all the floodlights had come on, and so I asked the captain. I said, "Is the car in place?" And he said, yes, shook his head, yes. I don't think he understood what I said. And so we walked out, and the car was not in place. He was 3 or 4 feet back at that time, but Detective Doherty was driving, and he was literally pushing people back with the bumper and slowly trying to get it into place. So when I walked out into that, all the floodlights come on, I looked down, and I saw Ruby standing there, and he had the pistol in his hand against his leg right here, like this. And so I immediately knew exactly what was going to happen. So I jerked back on him to try to pull him behind me, but I was right against him, and I didn't have any leverage. But that way all I did was turn his body so that the bullet, instead of hitting him here, hit him about 3 or 4 inches to the left of the navel and went all the way through and lodged, hit the 7th rib over here on this side and bounced off and lodged along here. So the 7th rib saved me, because if it hadn't stopped it, it went on through it and hit me somewhere along in here.
District Attorney Bill Alexander introduced the historic photograph taken by Dallas Times-Herald photographer Bob Jackson as Exhibit Number 9. The picture shows the actual moment in time Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald. Lavelle and another officer carried Oswald back to the jail office and laid him on the floor and removed the handcuffs. Lavelle saw the gunshot wound on Oswald's left side just under his short ribs. After he removed the handcuffs, Ruby was brought into the jail office. As Lavelle stood up and was putting his handcuffs in his belt, he heard Ruby say, and I'm quoting directly from testimony today, "I hope the son of a bitch dies." According to Lavelle, all of this happened within a minute of the shooting. He thereafter accompanied Oswald to Parkland Hospital in the ambulance. Parkland is where Oswald died. A nurse later brought to Lavelle the bullet recovered from Oswald, the same bullet introduced to jurors late this afternoon. Dallas County Medical Examiner Dr. Earl Forrest Rose was the last witness of the day, confirming his opinion that Lee Harvey Oswald died as a result of a gunshot wound to the chest.
Throughout the day, Jack Ruby's lawyers, Melvin Belli and Joe Tonnahill, used every opportunity on cross-examination to urge jurors that Ruby's actions were not those of a man acting with premeditation and malice aforethought, but that Ruby was in what he says is a fugued mental blackout state emanating from psychomotor epilepsy. For example, during the cross-examination of Detective Jim Lavelle, Belli asked whether the picture taken by newsman Bob Jackson showed that Ruby was pulling the trigger with his middle finger instead of his index finger. Belli also pointed out that even though Ruby had no ill will against Lavelle or any of the police officers, he was still pulling the trigger even when the gun was not pointed at Oswald. In response, Detective Lavelle said, "I've examined that picture with a magnifying glass, and I just couldn't actually say which finger was on the trigger." Belli also asked Lavelle whether the statement by Ruby that he, quote, "hope the son of a bitch dies," end quote, could have been made in response to hearing someone in the crowd hearing, "Oswald's been shot," as opposed to Ruby making the statement about something he did. Lavelle conceded it was possible. The timeline of the money order is an important part of Ruby's defense. Through their cross-examination, Belli and Tonnahill pointed out that when Ruby was at Western Union, he was not acting nervous or rushed, and he left his beloved dog Sheba in his car outside the Western Union office.
To Belli and Tonnahill, all of this proves that Ruby was not in a normal state of mind. Rather, Ruby was acting as an automaton in a blackout state caused by psychomotor epilepsy. According to Dallas Morning News' employee, Georgia Mayer, Ruby had a fixed stare while in the newspaper's offices upon hearing the news of the assassination. The defense asked her whether she had ever seen anyone in an epileptic seizure and whether Ruby appeared to have been in one. The defense also compared Ruby to a Damon Runyon character, the type of person that is not particularly liked by anyone but is tolerated and otherwise harmless.
The verbal sparring between the lawyers that began at the first bond hearing in December continues during the trial. Melvin Belli asked a witness whether some police officers and prosecutors were members of Jack Ruby's strip club called the Carousel Club. Officer T.B. Leonard was asked by the defense about Ruby's character, describing him as odd and excitable. When the state asked if he was an attention seeker, defense attorney Melvin Belli stood and said, "We all want a little attention, even the district attorney." The comment drew ire and objection of the district attorney, one sustained by Judge Joe B. Brown. Belli later asked a witness whether he was present when District Attorney Wade said Lee Harvey Oswald is the man who shot the president, and he's the man that will have to go to the electric chair. The objection by the district attorney to this line of questioning was also sustained.
Day one of the trial of the century has come to an end. Tomorrow, District Attorney Henry Wade and his assistant, Bill Alexander, are expected to call additional Dallas police officers to testify about statements allegedly made by Ruby in the chaotic moments after the killing. I'm Brandon Birmingham.
And I'm Eric Bushman. This is the State of Texas versus Jack Ruby, the original trial of the century. Join us tomorrow evening.
Bibliography. The transcript of the trial of Jack Ruby is publicly available online from the Texas State Library Archives Commission, the Texas Digital Archive, and the Court of Criminal Appeals Centralized Court Case Files Collection. I used a number of articles from the Dallas Morning News available on their online news bank. The first one is Carl Freund and Hugh Ainsworth. Quote, "Ruby shot, then muttered he hoped Oswald died, detective tells court." That was published on page 1. All of these are from March 5th. The next article is titled "Attention Turns Briefly to Ruby." That was on page 18. The next one is "Western Union Figures Spur Ruby Trial Debate." That was on page 18 as well. "Ruby Rivals Differ Over Finger Use." That was on page 18. I also used a number of articles from the Dallas Times-Herald. Those are on location at the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, donated by Dallas Times-Herald reporter Bob Finley. The first one was Jerry Richmond, and Bob Finley wrote, "First witnesses call Ruby volatile as prosecution starts building case." Bob Finley also wrote, defense went all out to win prospective jurors' sympathy for Ruby. Jim Lehrer, he wrote, 12 citizens begin deciding Ruby's future, March 4th of 1964. Stan Weinberg, he wrote an article called Decorum Policy of Judge Wilson. Staff writers wrote, Texas Supreme Court again refuses hearing on TV witness status. These are all from March 4th of 1964. Get Well, Your Honor, that was another title of an article from the Dallas Times-Herald. Process of trial outlined, and pale but relaxed, Ruby quietly pleads not guilty. All of those were from the Dallas Times-Herald.